While 3D gaming had been around for a long time before, the real shift to mainstream acceptance and promotion occurred in the mid-1990s. First, it was the arcade that really started making big changes to the way we viewed and played games. No longer slow and simple looking, polygon titles from companies like Sega and Namco really started to show the potential the technology held. Once textured mapping showed up, it was clear that the future of the hobby was in for some massive changes. Home consoles began their own metamorphosis during this time as well. Machines like the 3DO and Jaguar began showing us what 3D games could be, and then the Saturn and PlayStation picked it up from there. During this era, many genres translated well to 3D. Racing and aerial combat titles in particular benefited from the transition, looking and playing far better than their sprite-based counterparts. But other genres had a much harder time making the switch. It took multiple tries for some companies to get it right, while others failed all the way around. In this episode, we will be taking a look at the series that made the jump to 3D successfully, and gave us something very much worth playing. I've got 16 titles to go over, so let's get started. We begin this journey by starting with a game that completely changed my perspective on 3D platforming. The two-dimensional Mario games had always been special, and Super Mario 64 was a brilliant jump to 3D, nailing everything that made the 2D adventures so much fun while adding new powers, enemies, and secrets to find. There's no question the design here is tried and true Nintendo, so it already had a lot going for it. But it was the simple action of moving Mario around that was such a resounding success. Utilizing their analog stick, just running around the 3D play areas was a joyous occasion. It just felt right, and the gameplay felt like an extension of your will. It single-handedly secured a successful launch for the platform, despite lacking many titles backing it up. Super Mario 64 was the template for 3D platformers for years, and remains one of the finest examples of that genre for any console. Nintendo wasn't done successfully moving its 2D franchises into the polygon realm, and they did it again with The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. The previous 2D games had been fantastic adventures in their own right, and this new one gave you a massive world to explore, discover tons of new friends and enemies, and of course find items to help you along the way. Since the combat in this one was more evolved than it was in Super Mario 64, Nintendo used lock-on mechanics so you could easily focus your aggression on your foes with pinpoint accuracy. The combat, the sound, the art design all fell right in line with what you expected from this world. There's time travel, devilish temples to conquer, and even a horse you can use to travel around on. There was so much to do, so much to see, and only so many hours in the day to soak it all up. Again, Nintendo had made a game for the ages, and it left developers chasing its greatness for a long time to follow. Yup, we are still on Nintendo if you can believe it, because they scored yet another winner with Mario Kart 64. This one took that flat, simplistic racer on the Super Nintendo and opened us up to the world of Mario and company like never before. Being a racing game, this one saw a massive improvement in pretty much every way. The tracks are more dynamic, with a ton more to see and interact with. There's always stuff trying to smash you, wreck you, and knock you off the track. Nintendo was smart to focus on the multiplayer as well, because that was one of the very best things about the original. With an all-star cast, many tracks to open, and multiple speed-based difficulties to learn, Mario Kart 64 was a real blast. Nintendo's trifecta of Mario 64, Mario Kart 64, and Ocarina of Time pretty much sold the Nintendo 64 in the West. Nintendo's eye for accessible gaming served them well, and made a world of difference during that generation. Sega made a number of games in the Outrun series. These were what were known as super scalers, or two-dimensional sprites that were scaled in such a way that it made it look like they were moving in three-dimensional space. But when they made the move to a fully polygonal engine in Outrun 2, they created one of the finest arcade experiences I've ever seen. Not only was it drop-dead gorgeous with a blistering frame rate and recognizable set pieces, but it also took the gameplay up a notch with a brilliant drifting mechanic that made sure your speed was always fast and furious. It keeps the multipath courses that are typically fashioned around certain landmarks, like the Golden Gate Bridge and Niagara Falls. There's also a few other tests of skill that you have when you're doing stunts for your girlfriend's approval. This was the high point of Sega arcade racing for me, and I have still not seen its equal in raw fun factor and playability. Metroid was a fantastic series in 2D, and when word came out that Nintendo had offloaded the 3D entry to an outside developer, I was skeptical as all get out. Boy was I wrong, because Metroid Prime blew away my expectations top to bottom. This GameCube title had visuals that were freakishly alien, yet some of the best at the time. The entire world was connected, but you didn't always have the right tools to make your way through the many obstacles that stood in your way. That meant lots of exploration, hunting enemies, and finding everything you needed to become more powerful and better prepared for the world. If you had told me before that Metroid would make an excellent game played from a first-person view, I likely would have laughed it off. But the fine folks at Retro Studios pulled it off with a resounding success. The two-dimensional Metal Gear games were all over the place in terms of quality and likability. Some were really fun, while others not so much. That all changed when Metal Gear Solid showed up for the Sony PlayStation. It was played mostly from a similar top-down viewpoint, but the move to polygons changed everything. You could now go into first-person view to see every tiny detail around you. You could take to corners to get a better view of an approaching enemy. You could look down the scope of a weapon and blow away your foe long distance. The move to 3D also greatly elevated the things you could interact with around you. There were air vents to hide in, beds to hide under, and bad guys you could dupe into following footprints to their doom. Couple all that with a crazy story, memorable characters, and multiple endings, and you had tactical espionage like you had never seen it before. Blood Omen Legacy of Kain was a fairly good two-dimensional top-down adventure game where you played a vampire caught up in a conflict to save the land of Nosgoth. There's betrayal, time travel, and a choice whether to save the world or damn it to unending corruption. When the sequel showed up, it transitioned the series into a fully 3D adventure. The world of Nosgoth is now decidedly darker and more foreboding, with twisted creatures at every turn. The cool thing about this one is you do not play the main character of the first game. Instead, you play as Raziel, a vampire who is murdered at the hands of the original game's main character. You reawaken to a world you no longer recognize, hell-bent on revenge. The gameplay here is as captivating as the story. You gain new abilities while exploring and defeating your former brothers. There's multiple ways to dispatch your enemies, and each one typically has a weakness that must be exploited. It's so cool impaling them or throwing them into fire. It was a major step up in presentation and mechanics over the original, and it spawned multiple sequels before the story was fully told. The first Afterburner was a superscaler like Outrun, so it also used 2D sprites to give us a pseudo 3D feel. There were a few offshoots of the series that went the polygon route, but it wasn't until after Burner Climax showed up that the mainline series embraced the three-dimensional world. And wow, was it a looker! Fast, detailed, and with gameplay that absolutely killed its superscaler cousins, Climax was a massive improvement in pretty much every area. The gameplay itself was built very much on the same principles as before. On-rail shooting action where your main objective was to simply survive. They did add a new feature that slowed time, which allowed you to target large group of enemies for huge score bonuses, but otherwise it was still Afterburner in pretty much every way. Unfortunately, it's been delisted from the various consoles it was released for, leaving the arcade edition the only way you can legally play it today. On the positive side, there are emulated options available should you choose to explore them. The first Rayman showed up on a few consoles in the mid-90s, and was easily one of the prettiest 2D games available. Its lush, colorful world and characters really stood out as an early example of just how much better machines like the PlayStation and Saturn were at the technology. And you can bet I was blown away when its sequel showed up just a few years later and did the same for 3D graphics. Rayman 2: The Great Escape was so well done, and brought us an equally colorful world full of engrossing gameplay that gave Mario 64 a run for his money. There was plenty to collect, puzzles to solve, and bad guys to put down. So popular was its Nintendo 64 release, it was ported over to the PlayStation 1 and 2, Dreamcast, PC, mobile, Nintendo DS, and 3DS over the span of a decade. If you enjoy three-dimensional platformers, especially the type where exploration and collecting are a major focus, this one should entertain you quite well. On the Dreamcast with a VGA box, it was a visual knockout. Road Rash was easily one of my very favorites on the Sega Genesis. The combat-laden racing action was a breath of fresh air in an otherwise often boring genre. When it made its jump to 3D on the 3DO, it took an already great series and made it even better. The gameplay was tighter, more responsive, and the new full-motion video cinematics added quite a bit of character. The licensed soundtrack was a perfect fit, and it kept everything you loved about the older 16-bit releases, like bike upgrades, avoiding the cops, talking to the other bikers, and the various levels of speed and track size. The visuals had an almost hypnotic flow about them, like you were on rails, yet had a measure of control over where you traveled. It was one of my absolute favorites that eventually saw releases on the other 32-bit consoles, and then received multiple sequels on top of that. If you go back and play it today, be sure to do so on the PC. There, this sucker runs buttery smooth and is in a much higher resolution. The Sega Sports branding was a mess on the Saturn. What had been a powerhouse label on the Genesis was loaded with so-so releases on the Saturn that showed up late and lacked the same quality. But there was one set of games on the Genesis that translated fantastically to 3D, and that was World Series Baseball. The later Genesis versions were using digitized assets already, but the jump to 3D playfields and stadiums was stark. It was a gorgeous upgrade, and the best part was the gameplay was just as impressive. By the last entry on Saturn, Sega had even gone with fully polygonal players. The quality here was the complete opposite of what happened with Sega's NFL series. That piece of garbage was like someone stuck shards of glass up your ass and expected you to pay for it. It looked, sounded, and played like Sega of America didn't care a lick. Not particularly surprising, World Series Baseball was developed by Sega's Japanese arm, and the quality here shows it unmistakably. If the entire Sega Sports lineup had been this good all the way through, Saturn may have fared a little bit better.
That's got potential. The ball is well hit. It could be extra bases. He scores.
You're out of there!
I think when talking about 2D to 3D, one of the classic examples of undeniable success has to be Grand Theft Auto. The first two games had been overhead 2.5D adventures, but when the third one was released, it put the camera behind the player's back and opened up an entire world to explore from a brand new perspective. The change to a fully 3D polygon world was such a success here because it kept all the interaction from before and even added some more. Every activity became sort of its own minigame. Driving, melee combat, gunplay, hell, even just getting from point A to point B often became its own joyful exercise. The mayhem you could cause was unreal, and having a ton of cops after you while you ran for your life was priceless. A lot of folks like to talk about the PlayStation 2's early success as if it was all owed to DVD. I'm telling you it's this game right here that was just as important to those sales. It showed up only a year after the console launched in the West, and it was the best-selling game of 2001 and the second best-selling game of 2002, only behind its own sequel, Vice City. That was a single game selling 7 million units worldwide. That was almost as many Dreamcast consoles in existence.
Say hello to 8-Ball, ladies.
8-Ball's got some business upstairs. Well, maybe you could do me a favor. One of my girls needs a ride, so grab a car and pick up Misty from the clinic, then bring her back here. Remember, no one messes with my girls. So keep your hands on the wheel. If you don't mess this up, maybe there'll be more work for you. Now get out of here.
Whether you were a Nintendo kid or a Sega kid back in the day, there was a Ninja Gaiden for you. This series saw an arcade release that was spun off into numerous games for various consoles. Most of them were different, but still quite good themselves. It took Tecmo a while, but when they finally got around to a 3D Ninja Gaiden, it was rockstar quality beginning to end. It showed up first on the original Xbox, and there it made quite the impression. Its beautiful world was a joy to traverse. Wall jumping, wall running, and swinging from ropes made getting around fun as hell, and the combat system relied on strategic blocking and counterattacking to survive. It was tough, but the reward was equal to a modern Souls game. It was extremely well received and went on to get ports to an entire slew of different consoles. It's amazing how good this still looks and plays, a testament to the lasting legacy of this great franchise. Rygar on the NES is an often overlooked 2D adventure that has you searching high and low for new items to get around your world better. I loved it, so when the 3D take on the subject showed up in 2002 for the PlayStation 2, I was very curious to see how it turned out. And I was met with a game that not only looked and sounded great, but the combo-laden gameplay was awesome too. Using the disc armor, which is a shield that's attached to you, you can beat down enemies, block, interact with the environment, and level up your items for more powerful moves. I describe it as a mix of Resident Evil Code Veronica and God of War. There were many puzzle-like obstacles to get past, new moves to discover, and tons of exploration. It used fixed and follow-along camera angles, and the combat often uses lots of wide sweeping attacks that can hit many enemies at once. Much of the environment could be destroyed as well. I really enjoyed this and wish it had been given some proper sequels. There was a Wii port of it many years later, but I really wanted to see a new adventure on more powerful hardware. Still, it was a fine jump from 2D to 3D, and it still holds up well today. Shining Force was a great series of strategy games for the Sega Genesis. They were deep, but didn't overwhelm the player with a bunch of stats and options that drowned you in a 20-minute tutorial just to get you started. And when it moved to 3D on the Sega Saturn, it was a glorious success. Sega essentially did the reverse of what many RPG and strategy games were doing at the time. It used two-dimensional character sprites in a polygon world for the exploration portion of the game, and 3D player models against 2D backgrounds for the battle interactions. And I think it worked brilliantly. When you visited a town or area in Shining Force 3, it was laid out in 3D so you could see huge portions of the area in great detail. In combat, the heroes and villains looked great, and the special effects were a sight to behold. I really like that Sega chose this direction because it gives the game a unique look from many of its contemporaries. The quality of the game itself was top-notch too, easily up there with the Vandal Hearts and Final Fantasy Tactics of the world. There were 2 more parts to the story that stayed in Japan back then, but thankfully, we have community-translated versions available today. Everyone knows Pac-Man. Whether you were there at its release or privy to one of its many ports, the little yellow ghost gobbler was a major part of gaming for years. And outside of a strange VR release in the arcade in 1996, they were all 2D for the longest time. That was until 1999 when we received PacMan World on the Sony PlayStation. And what a move to 3D it was! It sort of puts you in mind of a Crash Bandicoot title, a 3D platformer that has you running, collecting, and jumping on top of enemies. Much of the gameplay from there is opening up doors and platforms to get to new areas. The attacks take on a Castle of Illusion style butt bounce that is charmingly similar to other platformers, so much of this feels familiar in a good way. I was quite taken with it, and it was remade recently under the title PacMan World Repack and is available for every major platform. You may not have believed it, but Pac-Man made for one hell of a 3D adventure. The move to 3D polygons came with numerous casualties. Go back to the mid-1990s and take a look at the companies that struggled or disappeared entirely. Nearly all of them had big trouble moving their games from 2D to 3D. Even Sega themselves had all kinds of issues doing this, leading to many of the problems that had dogged the Sega Saturn. One of the reasons Nintendo was able to do well with the Nintendo 64 was because so many of their franchises did well in this regard. For a stretch of time, polygons were all anyone wanted, and if you couldn't adapt to that expectation, chances are you crashed and burned pretty quickly. While this video tackled the best two-dimensional series to move over to polygons, there were many that took multiple iterations to get it right. And even then, you will get arguments on how good it actually was. In our next video, we will tackle the 2D series that made the absolute worst move to polygons. I hope you return for that one and check it out. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.